What was Mary's life really like in Nazareth 2,000 years ago? Not the Mary of stained glass and silent prayer, the Mary who woke before sunrise in a stone house built into a hillside, who ground grain for 3 hours until her shoulders burned, who carried 20 kilograms of water on her head from the village well. This was not a life of contemplation, it was a life of unrelenting physical labor. This was not the backdrop to a miracle. It was Tuesday in first century Galilee. Most people imagine Nazareth as a quiet, pious village where families lived simply and faithfully. But the archaeological record tells a different story. It reveals a world of economic pressure, cultural resistance, and backbreaking domestic work. A world where survival depended on a woman's skill with a handmill, a spindle, and a clay oven. Mary's daily life was shaped not by theology, but by the realities of subsistence farming, Roman taxation, and the rigid social codes of an honor-shame culture. Stay until the end, because understanding the physical world Mary lived in transforms how we see her story. Nazareth sat in the hills of Lower Galilee, 5 kilometers from the gleaming Roman city of Sepphoris. The contrast was stark. Sepphoris was urban, Romanized, diverse. It had a theater, bathhouses, paved streets laid out in a grid. Its population included Jews, pagans, and later Christians. It was a city of 8 to 12,000 people, a hub of administration and trade. Nazareth was none of those things. It was a village of 200 to 400 residents, a cluster of stone houses built into soft limestone hillsides, a place defined not by what it had, but by what it refused. Archaeology reveals the boundary. In the valley between Nazareth and Sepphoris, settlement patterns shift. Villages closer to the city adopted Roman customs, spreading domestic waste on fields, using imported pottery and glass. Nazareth did not. Its material culture was narrow, intentional, exclusively Jewish. Limestone vessels filled the homes, vessels that could not contract ritual impurity. This was not coincidence. It was choice. Nazareth was a conservative enclave in a region shaped by Roman power. It clung to purity laws and traditional customs, while the city on the hill embodied imperial influence. For a woman like Mary, this meant living in a community that defined itself through religious distinctiveness and cultural resistance. The economy was agricultural, supplemented by quarrying and small-scale craft production. Stone-cutting tools and unfinished vessels suggest the village served surrounding farms. But subsistence came at a cost. Roman taxation and Herodian building projects drained as much as 50% of a family's yield. Debt was common. Land loss was a constant threat. The landscape itself shaped survival. Soft limestone bedrock allowed families to carve storage pits, cisterns, and silos directly into the hillside. These subterranean spaces preserved grain, oil, and wine through the dry summers and unpredictable winters. During revolts, they became hiding places. Mary's world was not picturesque. It was precarious, shaped by the twin pressures of empire and environment. Mary's home was not a single structure. It was part of a family compound, a cluster of rooms built around a shared courtyard where parents, married sons, and their children lived under one roof system. This was the architecture of the extended family. A typical house began as one large room, the tracklin, used for eating, socializing, and sleeping. As sons married, they added units to the complex, each generation expanding around the central courtyard. The result was an organic, multi-generational household where privacy was rare and communal life was constant. The walls were limestone or basalt, depending on local geology. In Nazareth, limestone dominated. Builders used field stones or roughly squared rocks, wedging smaller stones between larger ones for stability. A stonemason, a tecton, would use wooden scaffolding to shape the blocks. The walls were plastered with mud and straw for insulation, then whitewashed inside to reflect the limited light from small, high windows and oil lamps. Roofs were flat and functional. Wooden beams supported a layer of tree branches covered with thick clay. When it rained, the clay absorbed water and expanded, sealing the roof. In summer, the clay cracked and required annual repair. A wooden ladder on the exterior led to the roof, which was surrounded by a low parapet. This elevated space was used for drying clothes and flax for storage, and during hot months for sleeping under the open sky. The courtyard was the center of a woman's world. It held the clay oven, the cistern, the grinding stones. It was where bread was baked, where clothes were washed, where thread was spun. Because houses were built close together to maximize agricultural land, courtyards were often shared by multiple families. Domestic labor became communal. Children played in common spaces. Women worked side by side. The floor was packed earth or stone paving. Storage was managed through rock-cut pits carved into the bedrock beneath the house, cool, dark spaces for preserving grain, oil, and wine. This was not a home designed by architects. It was a living structure, shaped by necessity and kinship, evolving with each marriage and birth. For Mary, the courtyard house was both workspace and social universe, a place of constant activity, shared burdens, and the relentless rhythms of survival. The grinding of grain was the sound of survival. Every morning, women across Nazareth knelt at their handmills, two heavy basalt stones, one rotating over the other, and began the slow, repetitive work of turning whole kernels into flour. For an average family of 6, this took 2 to 3 hours, every single day. The upper stone had a wooden handle. A woman would grip it and push, leaning her weight into the circular motion, feeling the resistance as the grain cracked and powdered between the stones. Her shoulders burned, her lower back ached. The monotonous scraping rhythm became the metronome of the household. This was not optional labor. Without flour, there was no bread. Without bread, there was no meal. Barley was the grain of the poor, dense, heavy, difficult to leaven. Wheat was preferred for its lighter texture and better rise, but it cost more and was often reserved for festivals or the tables of the wealthy. A peasant family in Nazareth ate barley bread, thick and filling, the taste of necessity. Once the grain was ground, the flour was mixed with water and a piece of fermented dough saved from the previous day's batch. This natural yeast gave the bread its rise. The dough was kneaded in wooden troughs, then shaped into small, flat rounds. Baking happened quickly in the domed clay oven, the taben, which stood in the courtyard, fed by charcoal or dried dung. Before baking, a small portion of the dough was set aside. This was the challah, a sacred offering, a ritual that transformed domestic labor into an act of worship. The bread was baked in small batches to prevent spoilage in the heat. What emerged from the oven was still warm, torn, and shared at the table, the staff of life, earned through hours of invisible, back-breaking work. Archaeology reveals that multiple grinding stones are often found in a single courtyard, suggesting women worked together. They sang, they spoke, they eased the tedium through shared presence. This was how bread was made, not quickly, not easily, but daily, without fail, by the hands of women. The table was sparse, bread was the center, barley for the poor, wheat for those who could afford it. Around it, the rest of the meal took shape from what the land and the season provided. Lentils and beans were the foundation. Stewed together with onions, garlic, and leeks, they became the evening meal. Thick, filling, the poor man's meat. These legumes were high in protein and could be dried and stored through the winter, making them essential for survival when fresh produce disappeared. Vegetables were eaten daily. Cucumbers, onions, and garlic were valued not only for flavor, but for their perceived medicinal properties. They were eaten raw, pickled, or cooked into stews. Herbs like mint and hyssop added taste and were believed to aid digestion and prevent illness. Fruit provided sweetness. Figs, grapes, and pomegranates were consumed fresh during harvest or dried for year-round use. Grapes were also pressed into wine or boiled down into dibs, a thick, sweet syrup used to flavor bread and porridge. Honey was rare and expensive. Sugar did not exist. Dairy came from goats and sheep, not cows. Fresh milk spoiled quickly in the heat, so it was immediately churned into curds or pressed into cheese. These were staples, eaten with bread at nearly every meal. Olive oil was everywhere. It dressed vegetables, preserved food, fueled lamps, and served as a cooking fat. Butter was uncommon, considered a luxury of nomadic herders. Meat was not part of the daily diet. It appeared at weddings, religious festivals, or when a family could afford to slaughter an aging sheep or goat fattened on grain. For most, fish was the more common protein, salted or dried, transported from the Sea of Galilee and eaten sparingly to stretch supplies. Chickens and pigeons provided eggs and occasional meat. Pigeons held special significance as the poor person's sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem, a reminder that even the humblest household participated in the religious life of the nation. This was not abundance, it was subsistence, calculated, seasonal, and earned through unrelenting labor. Clothing was not purchased, it was made from scratch, by hand, through a process that began with raw fiber and ended months later with a finished garment. Nothing in Mary's wardrobe came from a market stall. Every thread in her tunic, every stripe in her mantle, every fold in her head covering passed through the hands of women, her mother, her neighbors, herself. The process began with flax or wool. Flax grew in the fields of Galilee, harvested and retted in water to separate the fibers. Wool came from sheep, shorn annually and washed to remove lanolin and dirt. Both required preparation before they could be spun. Spinning was constant work. A woman carried a distaff and spindle everywhere, to the well, to the courtyard, to the roof. The motion became automatic, twist, drop, wind, twist, drop, wind. Raw fiber transformed into thread through repetition, through muscle memory, through hours stolen from other tasks. Once spun, the thread was dyed. Woad produced blue, common, affordable, the color of working people. Madder root yielded red and brown tones. Yellow came from pomegranate rinds. Purple, extracted from the murex snail, was reserved for royalty and the extreme wealthy. Most peasant garments remained the natural color of the wool or were dyed in earth tones that masked dirt and wear. Weaving happened on looms set up in courtyards where light was strongest. In Galilee, some looms were built to produce cloth wider than the standard, allowing for seamless one-piece garments. A woman's skill at the loom was a measure of her virtue. Her industry was visible in the quality and durability of what she produced. The result was clothing designed for function, not fashion. Mary would have worn an ankle-length tunic, the ketonet, made from two pieces of fabric joined at the shoulders and sides. Over it, a large rectangular mantle, the simla, served as cloak, blanket, and formal covering. In public, a head covering was essential, a square cloth folded and draped, held in place by a cord, protecting from sun and satisfying the codes of modesty. On her feet, leather sandals. In winter, ankle-high boots against the mud. Around her wrists or ankles, perhaps a simple bronze bracelet, minimal adornment, but enough to mark identity and status. This clothing was more than protection from the elements. It was a declaration of village, of clan, of adherence to the laws that set her people apart from the Roman world just 5 kilometers west. Mary was likely betrothed at 12 or 13. This was not unusual. It was expected. Betrothal, erusin, was a legally binding contract arranged by parents, often through an intermediary. It happened roughly a year before the couple began living together. During that year, the woman remained in her father's house while the groom prepared a place in his family's compound and paid the bride price, compensation for the loss of her labor. Once betrothed, the couple was legally married. Any breach required a formal divorce. Any infidelity was treated as adultery. The wedding itself was a week-long celebration. The groom led a torchlit procession to the bride's home, then brought her back to his father's household amid music and communal feasting. She entered not as an independent woman, but as the newest member of her husband's extended family, under the authority of her mother-in-law. Her primary role was clear: bear children, preferably sons. Fertility was honor, barrenness was shame. A woman's worth was measured in her ability to produce heirs, to continue the family line, to secure the household's future. But motherhood was dangerous. Archaeological evidence from Palestinian tombs reveals that 35 to 50% of children died before age 5. The first year was the most hazardous. To raise 2 or 3 children to adulthood, a woman might endure 8 pregnancies, spending nearly her entire fertile life in a cycle of conception, birth, and nursing. Childbirth happened at home. Midwives attended, along with female relatives. The mother sat on a birthing stool, gripping its handles as contractions intensified. Midwives massaged her with warm olive oil and offered herbal preparations to speed labor if it stalled. After birth, the infant was rubbed with salt to toughen the skin, then wrapped tightly in swaddling cloths to ensure the limbs grew straight. Amulets inscribed with protective formulas were placed near the child to ward off spirits believed to prey on the vulnerable. Despite these efforts, maternal and infant mortality remained high. Skeletal evidence shows that many newborns had undersized bones, signs of poor maternal nutrition and chronic stress during pregnancy. For Mary, motherhood was not a gentle calling. It was survival, repeated, under the constant shadow of loss. Women were the physicians of the household. There were no clinics in Nazareth, no trained doctors making rounds. When a child spiked a fever or a wound turned red, it was a mother or grandmother who reached for remedies passed down through generations of women. These remedies came from the hills. Garlic and onions were crushed and applied to infections, their natural antibacterial properties treating wounds and intestinal parasites. Chamomile was brewed into a rinse for inflamed eyes or given to colicky infants to settle their stomachs. Yarrow stopped bleeding and pressed into cuts. Willow bark, steeped in hot water, brought down fevers. Marshmallow root became cough syrup. Mint eased headaches. Aloe soothed burns. Hyssop treated respiratory illness and skin conditions. This knowledge was technological mastery, refined through trial and observation, transmitted from mother to daughter in the same way spinning and weaving were taught. But it was not enough. Archaeological remains reveal the limits. Leprosy, tuberculosis, parasitic infections in both rich and poor. Skeletal analysis shows chronic malnutrition, especially in women of childbearing age. Newborn bones frequently measure below normal, evidence that mothers were often malnourished or overworked during pregnancy. Health was not a baseline. It was a constant struggle against disease, poor sanitation, and the physical toll of unrelenting labor. For Mary, survival meant knowing which plants stopped infection and which eased pain. It meant reading the body signals and responding with whatever the land provided. It meant accepting that some illnesses had no remedy and some losses could not be prevented. The Sabbath began at sunset on Friday. Before the first star appeared, the house had to be ready. Floors swept, lamps filled with oil, the evening meal prepared in advance because no work, no lighting of fire, no kneading of dough, no carrying of water was permitted once the day of rest began. Mary would have spent Friday afternoon in a rush of final tasks, bread baked before sundown, stew left to simmer, the best of the week's food set aside for the Sabbath table, perhaps fish, perhaps chicken if the family could afford it. As darkness fell, she lit the Sabbath lamps. This was her responsibility. The flame marked the threshold between labor and rest, between the ordinary week and sacred time. The meal that followed was the highlight. Extended family gathered, the best bread, wine if there was any, a moment of abundance in a week defined by scarcity. But the Sabbath was not the only rhythm. Purity laws shaped the month. Menstruation required separation, niddah, followed by immersion in the mikveh, the ritual bath. Childbirth brought its own period of separation. These were not mere customs, they were the structure of holiness, the daily practice of being set apart. Limestone vessels filled Nazareth's homes because stone could not contract impurity. Every object was chosen with the law in mind. The synagogue gathered the village weekly, not a grand building, but a simple assembly where scripture was read aloud and discussed. Women were present, they heard the words, they taught their children the stories, the laws, the history of their people. Religion was not separate from daily life. It was the framework. Every loaf of bread carried a piece of dough set aside as offering. Every task timed to the calendar of festivals. Every choice filtered through the question, does this honor God? For Mary, the sacred and the mundane were inseparable. The lighting of a lamp was prayer. The grinding of grain was obedience. The rhythm of the week was the rhythm of faith. The village well was more than a water source. It was the nerve center of information, the site where women gathered daily and exchanged what mattered, whose child was sick, which family faced debt, where help was needed, who had violated communal norms. Mary did not live in isolation. Her world was intensely, inescapably communal. Domestic labor was rarely solitary. Grinding grain happened in groups, multiple women working side by side at stone mills in shared courtyards. The repetitive scraping of stone on stone became the backdrop to conversation. Bread baking brought women to communal ovens. Weaving and spinning often occurred in clusters where children played nearby and news circulated freely. These were not casual gatherings. They were the infrastructure of survival. When a family faced crisis, illness, death, harvest failure, it was the women's network that responded first. They brought food, they cared for children, they prepared bodies for burial, they enforced social boundaries and protected communal honor through collective scrutiny and mutual accountability. This was power, though it held no formal title. Women controlled social information. They knew who could be trusted, who needed help, who had overstepped. Through their daily labor networks, they influenced the village decisions and shaped the community's moral economy. For Mary, her circle of female relatives and neighbors was not a luxury, it was survival. These women taught her to grind grain, to birth children, to read the signs of illness, to navigate the unspoken codes of honor and shame. They provided the emotional and material support that made life under Roman occupation and economic exploitation endurable. The well, the courtyard, the communal oven, these were the democratic spaces of women's lives, where strength was built not through autonomy but through interdependence. Mary's life was not the quiet backdrop to a miracle. It was grain ground by hand until shoulders burned, water carried on her head from the village well, bread baked daily in a clay oven under a relentless sun, threads spun while walking, children born at home, swaddled in salt and hope, half of them buried before they reached 5. This was not poetry, this was endurance. Her world was shaped by the weight of Roman taxation, the rhythm of the Sabbath, and the unrelenting demands of subsistence. She lived in a stone house built into a hillside, part of a family compound where privacy did not exist and survival depended on the labor of women working side by side. She was not isolated. She was embedded in a network of female relatives and neighbors who ground grain together, shared the burdens of childbirth, and enforced the codes that held the village intact. Her strength was not spiritual abstraction, it was physical, technological, social. This was the real Nazareth. Not a setting for theology, but a place where women's hands built, fed, clothed, and sustained entire families under the crushing pressure of empire. If this expanded how you see Mary's world, hit like. Drop a comment with what surprised you most. Share this with someone who's curious about history as it was actually lived. And subscribe, because we're not done excavating the real lives behind the stories.